Good evening, everyone. Welcome to FAA Safety Briefing Live for the November and December edition. I'm Paul Prydecker, and of course, Susan Parson is with us. We're very happy to be here tonight and like to welcome you to this broadcast. So the last broadcast, we sort of teed up the idea that this would be our last FAA Safety Briefing Live. So it is, and we hope that throughout these broadcasts that we've always been educational and occasionally entertaining. But we have one more to do.
You're always entertaining, Paul.
Well, I try. It's a moving target, though.
I get it.
Yeah. We've got a great issue. It's all about risk management and its value in flight safety. So let's get started.
Yeah, you're giving it away before we get into it.
Well, that's what's entertaining.
Right.
As always, we have wings and AMT credit. And Susan, how do people do that?
Well, there are various ways to do it, but the simple way is by using the page you see here. You can get it at the two-step process. And the links on this page will also take you to the safety briefing team, podcast, archive courses. You can, if you've missed one of the broadcasts or you want to go back to the beginning and see something again, you can go take the archived course and get wings credit for that too. Print copy and lots more.
And as always, in order to work your way through this, you need to take the test. And
it's easy.
It's an easy test, but you might find some of the answers in the actual articles because we're not able to cover absolutely everything, but we'll do our best. And as we've often talked about, the purpose of FAA Safety Briefing magazine
we've always tried to be, we're trying to occupy the right niche for the FAA as the safety policy voice for non-commercial general aviation. We're not trying to imitate or copy what our colleagues in the trade press, the aviation trade press do. And you see our goals there to raise awareness of FAA resources, to explain safety and regulatory issues, and especially to encourage continued training because that's what good pilots do.
That's right. And it occurs in every aspect of the industry. We know the focus of this magazine and of this division. As you know, last week we were both at a conference overseas, and the entire focus of the two-day conference was in aviation training and how to make things better. And so that's what we'll continue to do here. So tell us about this issue.
So this one, you'll recognize if you reference this to a very popular aviation movie, both from several years ago and more recently. So we're calling it Fly Away from the Danger Zones, and it's tips for reducing risk in all phases of flight. And the feature pieces this time are divided into the phases of flight. And you see here we've got, we talk about sort of practical ways for risk management, which is the overall umbrella theme. Then we talk about pre-flight, taxi, takeoff and departure, en route, that's the avoiding loss of control. And then fine-tuning approach and landing and, doing landings that will allow you to walk away and reuse the airplane, which has always been one of my favorite jokes about aviation. Yeah.
And speaking of entertaining, I've occasionally hummed that song, Fly Away from the Danger Zone, but I'm not going to sing it.
You should. It's going to be stuck in your head after tonight.
I suppose it will be. So the first column is checklist, and it's
actually it's jump seat.
I'm sorry. First column is the jump seat column, and it's all about how to start out with risk management.
Yeah, I mean, this one kind of tees up the whole idea, and as you see in the center there, in going into the danger zone, okay, that's what military aviators do. It's the job. But for commercial or general aviation, the agency I work for expects and requires people to avoid the danger zone or danger zones as much as possible because that's where accidents can occur.
One of the paragraphs in the actual article, we don't have it up here, but it was discussing the idea that some people think that the industry is spending too much on risk management and not enough on the fundamentals like stick and rudder skills. Of course, that's not true because stick and rudder skills are part of risk management. And it's just a key element to how to keep us safe. As we work through this issue, we'll talk about, as Susan said, a variety of risk management tools to apply to all phases of flight, from thinking about just the pre-flight all the way to shutdown and shutting things off. But you've identified a 3-step process.
Actually, this is something that the safety team came up with many years ago, actually probably around this time that I started working for the FAA. There are lots of things you can use, but I always thought this one was very simple. Perceive, which is to identify hazards, and there are hazards in each category, and you can remember that from PAVE. Everybody probably knows PAVE by now: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. And then process is about analyzing it. You have to think about what is the severity, probability, or exposure of the risk, and then perform by finding ways to eliminate or mitigate the severity. I always thought that perceiving, well, that's a lot of times people can see the hazards, and if you know what it could do to you, you might be willing to do something about it. It's that process step in the middle that sometimes people miss. So it's really important to analyze as much as possible, as much as you can. What could this do to hurt me or my passengers, and what can I do to make sure that it doesn't?
And it's a very close parallel to another concept which we've talked about in these programs about threat and error management. This was something that was started in the mid-1900s, primarily at the level of Part 121 carriers, but it is thankfully kind of morphed into Part 135 and Part 91 operations as well. The principle is very much the same. You need to be able to anticipate what some of the threats might be, which is easy. If you know about taxiway closures, well, that's something that's known and you can easily perceive it. But of course, there's things that are not expected. So you have to have an awareness to be able to identify the possible threats. And what you're trying to do is to mitigate them, to prevent them from becoming errors, either in aircraft handling or in communications. But then if you do make an error, then you need to recover, which is the equivalent of performing some way. So it's all very similar. It's sound tools to be able to make it a safer environment for yourself and passengers and everything in the airspace system.
Well, one of the points made in this article, too, is that don't get hung up with the terms and the formal definitions.
Yeah.
The important thing is to pick something and use it to keep yourself safe, and don't worry too much about being able to parrot back what the terms mean.
And a lot of it is driven in SOPs and standard operating procedures, and getting familiar and developing a set of SOPs that work for you, checklists, compliance, and just a attitude that this is the way we're going to manage our flight. So speaking of flight management, CRM, of course, is a popular topic, and it doesn't always mean that you have a crew, although that's how it was first envisioned. But SRM, single pilot resource management, is of course essential for many of us that are, flying the very airplane that's shown in that picture.
Well, whether it is you flying by your very own self in the airplane or with passengers aboard, the whole idea is that you need to think of all the resources that you have, sort of like the rules require you to consider all available information. This is about using all available resources, both on board and outside, to ensure that the flight is successful. I was kind of the inspiration for this particular piece. Right about the time I was writing it, the New York Times ran this piece called "How to Do Everything." You have to go behind the paywall probably to read the article, but this was their tip writer, and she had shared 7 years of wisdom. And she had this whole chart in there, and you could click on one of the squares, and it was everything from how to get a cat out of a tree to how to escape a car that is submerged in water. I mean, it's just a little bit of everything. What she didn't have, of course, and the reason she should have, was how to do risk management. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll add that. I should probably send it to her. But then on the structured approach is what the risk management handbook suggests. And you have a bunch of words starting with P, very good letter: plan, plane, pilot, passengers, and programming. So it's still another way to work through what are the factors that can raise issues in the flight?
And of course, when we talk about resources, it's of course not just people. It's not just air traffic control or flight service or wherever you happen to get your briefings from, but resources are also your flight planning software that maybe you have on your iPad. It's a variety of tools that are available to us. And it's as we add more tools into our toolkit, of course, we have to know how to use them and manage them and not let the tools then become a distraction. We've talked about this before in terms of managing automation and, managing the flight deck of a technically advanced aircraft. That requires some resource management as well, so that what we perceive as benefits do not actually turn into distractions. When we talk about a plan, everybody thinks about the obvious things. Let's look at the weather. Let's look at a route. Top off the airplane, that sort of thing. But of course, the other part of planning is, and we get into this a little bit later, is be up to speed on performance planning. Go to different parts of the country, different altitudes that we may be dealing with at the airports, and all of the environmental factors associated with weather is just not an en route consideration, but of course, performance planning for takeoff and landing. And
another thing that's not listed there is planning for where would you go if you have to divert, and having a plan in not just a plan for where you're going to go, but a plan to let your passengers know that, hey, we might not get there at the time that we're planning to. We need to all be prepared for that.
Of course. And of course, in our plane, there's, from the simplest airplane to the more complex, they all have pilot operating handbooks and other supplemental information and the logs that go with them. So that's also, part of the grand scheme about having a structured approach, is making sure that we're up to date with our maintenance logbooks and all of the other legal requirements. And of course, we've talked about I'm safe a lot.
And personal minimums. Make sure that I always think of personal minimums as it's kind of like the buffer between your fuel reserve, what you're required to have, and what you need. And you always, you never want to go into the unusable fuel level of your skill or aircraft performance.
Yeah, the other thing, we've talked a lot about personal minimums, and I know you're a big advocate and believer in them, and I'm as well. But of course, they're not static.
No, they have to change.
They have to change based on maybe your own recency of experience, your own currency. Certainly, they can change on the weather that's involved, how long of a trip, maybe what
kind of airplane you're flying today.
And certainly what kind of an airplane you're flying today, because as you've pointed out, the most capable pilot can't do miracles in an airplane that's not capable of clearing up.
You may be a super pilot, but you're limited in a super cub.
Now I remember.
Yeah.
That's very good. So the personal minimums thing, again, it's a place to start. Feel free to change them, and remember that minimums are there for a reason. So, and passengers, we've actually had an issue in the past about, flying with companions, either companions who may be pilots or people who are completely unfamiliar with aviation and flying. And of course, we have a role to brief them and help let them be part of the process as well. And last, we just talked about this, about programming. Everything that we have in our flight deck that's, approaching the level of sophistication it does, needs to be understood. And the best time to do that is on the ground and not try to figure things out. And
well, on the programming side too, I just realized today, because I was fishing out some articles that I've written over the years. I've actually written a lot about programming and how important it is to make sure that you are not distracted by technology and you know how it works. So I didn't realize that must, until today when I saw how many articles there were, that must have been one of my favorite subjects.
Well, I think I saw one back from 2014 that you were writing,
at least.
and the concepts that you put out there were still valid, still valid today. I like taking courses or classes that are offered to help us learn, how to manage some of these things. But of course, the rule about, on a VFR day, you should be mostly outside. That's still a true statement. So single resource management, there's a great book about it. Resource Management Handbook from the FAA. You can find it on the web, and it's got a lot of good information for us. This is a great story.
Yeah, it didn't feel so great at the time.
It's your story, so I'll let you tell it, and then we can talk some more.
So when I was in college many years ago, more than I care to remember, I had a French professor, very elegant, she was everything you would think a French woman would be. And her grading standards were harsh. And what she did, if you made a mistake in each week's composition, she kept copies of everything you'd done and her corrections on it. And if you repeated a mistake, or if you made a mistake that we had already covered the grammar for in class, you lost a letter grade. So that was, you didn't have to make too many mistakes to get a 0. So one of my classmates early on asked her, and I can still see her just sort of standing there and sniffing down at him. Well, there's so many mistakes you haven't made for the first time yet. I can't possibly allow you to repeat any. And I've kind of carried that through life, because it didn't have to be just in French. And as I wrote in here, aviation mistakes can do a lot more damage than spoiling a grade point average. So the whole idea is don't make the same mistake twice, but also really do everything you possibly can to learn from the mistakes that other people make. And one of the best sources of information is the NASA forms, or the Aviation Safety Reporting System. We've talked about that in the magazine before. People focus a lot on the sanctions relief, but the fact is, it is as we put it here, a living directory of all kinds of information. It's free, it's confidential. There's an ASRS callback newsletter that you can subscribe to. And I love the part too that it lets you give back by sharing your mistakes or your observations in a completely anonymous and non-punitive environment. Over the years, I have contributed several reports to ASRS, not because I thought I was going to get, not because I'd really done anything wrong, but if I observed something like, something that happened on a frequency one time that I thought, wait, somebody needs to know that this is a problem. So the point is, this can be part of the all available resources, and it can help you make, if you're going to make mistakes, then create something new. Don't repeat mistakes that you or other people have already made. And hopefully you won't even create new ones, because who wants mistakes? But we know we're going to make them. And the NASA, the ASRS form is a great way to communicate that. We've had this conversation before, that I had a presentation that I used to share in the Part 121 environment to our ground school classes. And the presentation was called Never Waste a Mistake. And it was really sort of about the fact that we seem to have a short-term memory when it comes to lessons. How many times haven't we said to ourselves, and it's not necessarily about flying, but in this case, we could just keep it to flying, where you might do something that not quite right, maybe a little bit outside the limits, and you might scare yourself a little bit, and you'll say to yourself, I'll never do that again. Yeah. I'll never do that again. So you sharpen yourself a little bit, and then as time goes on, there's a tendency that maybe we could get a little bit more relaxed. I use the example in my classes about, we've all maybe had somebody who was a close friend or a colleague who maybe passed away, and they were our age, and we say, oh my goodness, he or she was my age, I'm going to be a better spouse, a better brother, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to exercise, and we have all these ideas.
and we do it for a while, and then we sort of ease up a little bit. And it's the same principle seems to occur in aviation, which is why recurrent training is so important, that we can, kind of reset our clock and kind of set the bar up where we want it. But as Susan said, mistakes that we make should be shared. There's value in it, and instead of we might hear about something on the news or read about something that happened in aviation, and our first tendency is to say, oh, what were those guys doing? I would never do that. But instead of having that attitude, we should say, what can I learn from this so that I won't do it myself, because we're all susceptible.
And by the way, the other thing about learning from the mistakes of others and sharing yours, not wasting any, it's not really part of this article, but that is very consistent with the FAA's compliance program, which is all about find the problem and fix it so that it doesn't happen again.
And tell them what you're going to do to prevent it, and to maybe, share it with others. So it's a good story about French. I'm sure you did well in the class.
I actually did, but
I'm sure it was hard.
It was very hard.
So, and starting on our
phases of flight.
First phase of flight is about pre-flight, and of course, it's not just about pre-flighting your aircraft, but there's so much more to it.
Well, and this goes into making a plan. There's so many things we talked about earlier, the various aspects of a plan. Always use checklists, not just the printed ones, but you need to use checklists for yourselves, for yourself. The aircraft must be both legally airworthy and in a condition for safe flight. They are not necessarily the same. My favorite story about that is there was an airplane. I sent a student to pre-flight one time, and all the paperwork was in order. All the inspections have been complied with, everything else. But I walked out, and he was a fairly new student, but I walked out and I went around to my side of the airplane, and I saw a puddle of oil dripping from underneath the airplane. And I stopped and I pointed and I said, "What about that?" "Oh, yes, I was wondering about that." I said, "Okay, let's talk about remedial pre-flight today. The airplane is bleeding. It is clearly not in a condition for safe flight." So obviously we didn't go that day. But you need to be looking for everything, looking for not just, I was trained to expect something to be wrong. It was my job to find what it was, not to assume that everything was going to be right. And that's part of enhancing your pre-flight inspection with a kit. The current checklist: working flashlight, fuel sampler, step ladder, safety glasses, screwdriver, whatever you think you will need. Don't rush. Make sure that you have proper attire. I would note that Wisconsin is rather cold right now, and there's snow on the ground, so you would not want to pre-flight without having proper winter attire. I've always thought, too, if you get interrupted, I was taught an acronym: interruptions always distract. So if you do get interrupted, either go back to the beginning or go back at least 2 steps from where you were when you got diverted. You got to make sure everything is moved, tie downs, covers, etc. How many times have you seen? Well, hopefully not too many times, but I have seen people start to move from the parking space with the chock still in, or with the tie down still on. Enforce a no distractions policy once again. Watch for changes, and then we talked about we've talked about before the fact that if an airplane has just come out of maintenance, you need to be extra careful to make sure that nothing has been missed.
Yeah, and I think again a pre-flight that is done the same way every time is part of an SOP, and you don't necessarily have to follow the path around the aircraft that might be in the POH. It's a good place to start, but if you want to modify it, that's fine. But the main point is, don't be complacent, especially if you have your own aircraft. I know how easy it could be that you just finished the flight, you put it in the hangar, and tomorrow you come out and you think, well, it was okay when I landed. It's probably okay now, but probably is not the right word. So,
yeah, I learned years ago from a flying friend of mine that if you have to use the word, if you find yourself, or if you have to use the word probably in connection with any kind of flight operation, you definitely need to rethink the plan. For example, we probably have enough fuel to get there. That's
yeah.
not a good place to go.
Yeah. I want to point out too, there's Advisory Circular 91.92, which is an advisory circular that's all about conducting effective pre-flight briefings. The focus of it is heavily weighted towards weather and obtaining weather information and all of the sources, both public and private. It's an excellent resource. I was on part of a webinar, maybe it was back in September or October, I don't quite remember when, maybe it's October, where people from industry and government and academia got together to present a webinar on this advisory circular, highlighting different parts of it. It was about a 2-hour webinar with a lot of good information from the presenters. So if you haven't seen 9192, have a look at that. And also there's new briefings available, self-briefings for VFR pilot and self-briefing for IFR pilots, which are also available. So again, it's not just about, your airplane, but it's also about your own preparation and about you. So
I would add, even though it doesn't talk about in this article, passengers.
Of course.
You want to pre-flight your passengers too.
Yeah. But I learned the hard way not to let my passengers be a distraction. So with the idea that if you get distracted, start over and have your passengers take a seat somewhere else until you're done. Runway safety is such a huge initiative within the FAA. It's getting a lot of focus areas. And your colleague, Tom Hoffman, wrote a nice article about, taxi tips.
Improving your ground game. We actually did a whole issue on surface safety a few months ago, a while back. I sometimes forget when they were, but anyway, some of the things he talks about is expect the unexpected, which means study before you taxi, use the moving map displays, make sure you understand the signs. And sometimes there are big airports, more taxiways than letters in the alphabet, so you need to know what they mean. Hotspots, the FAA is putting a lot more effort into identifying hotspots on charts. Those are places where you could get in trouble, and you definitely need to look and find out where they are before you go try to move around the airport.
And on the FAA charts, they've standardized on 3 symbologies to identify the different types of hotspots.
You need to listen to the ATIS for any particular information. Sometimes it's just the weather information, but there's also construction notices, runway closures. I've always liked this tip: set heading bug to assigned runway before you taxi and verify it when it's lined up. So don't ever let expectation bias, what you think it will be, influence what you actually do. Always ask ATC. I think we were talking about this before. If ATC would much rather have you ask than find you in a bad spot on the runway, or a place that you're not supposed to be, they'll always help. And literally don't cross lines until you've been advised that it's okay to do that.
And there's a lot of resources that help with all of the runway taxiway symbology, the letters, the numbers, the lines, all have special meanings. It's, if you're at a single runway airport that's not, doesn't have a lot there, there's still signs you need to pay attention up to and be aware of. At some of the more complicated airports with crossing, especially with crossing runways or with parallel runways, it's easy. As you know, I used to fly in and out of O'Hare quite a lot, and I always thought it was one of the best places, in terms of air traffic controllers. And people would often ask me, what's it like flying into O'Hare? And I'd say, well, just like any other airport until you get on the ground. I mean, an approach is an approach, and, it's just another airport. But, oh, my goodness, the activity on the ground, and even though they have standard taxi procedures, which you're expected to know what those are, you don't always know what you're going to get. I remember years ago flying out of Philadelphia, it was common, absolutely common, that your taxi route was going to be Golf Echo, hold short of 27 left, until it wasn't. And
expectation bias.
You bet, because there was a taxiway closure. Of course, it was NOTAMed, and but you have this idea about the way you're going to go because you've done it so many times. And if you apply the principles of threat area management, again, you're going to be thinking about these things. And just because you've been cleared to taxi doesn't necessarily mean you have to release the brake just then. Orient yourself on the airport, use your ship's position, and take advantage of that technology. So,
well, one of they mentioned resources. I'm going to put in a plug here, another one from the flight deck video series. The FAA has been doing videos that are really fun. I mean, they actually show you the view from the flight deck, from you flying the airplane into places and navigating around on the airport. And superimposed on them are the chart indications. So you can really see, you really have a lot of pre-flight surface safety resources available, and that's a good one.
Yeah. So our next phase of flight is here we are. Common takeoff and departure errors.
Yeah, don't try this. And he was playing with, don't try this at home, or don't try this on the runway. We focus a lot on certain parts, but takeoff departure, apparently, they're the second most common, according to the null report anyway. So takeoff has its own safety risks and opportunities, and the categories that were discussed here were the error categories anyway: planning, decision making, management, attention, and technique. So one of the things, and I know we all in ground school, we get to be pretty good at calculating performance data, takeoff and climb and cruise data and everything else. And then we get complacent and maybe we aren't so good about it, or we think that we know this airplane and we know exactly how it's going to work. But in fact, and this was interesting, this little piece, takeoff distance is decreased 10% for every 9 knots of headwind, but they increase by 10% for every 2 knots of tailwind. And you really need to know that before you try to get off.
Yeah, and what I've encouraged people to do too is that maybe on a day when you're not flying, you can always do what I call ground-based scenarios, where you can get your either your flight planning software, that if it's got it built into it, or your pilot operating handbook, and plan a couple of flights at different temperatures and density altitudes, and maybe while you're at it, throw in a couple of weight and balance issues, and just kind of know what the windows are. So it doesn't alleviate you from doing it for real every flight, but it's, as we talked about on before, it's, if you kind of know where the parameters are, then you know when something's wrong. Also, we need to pay attention to what's going on once, we're on the takeoff roll and taking off, and
do the instruments match?
Instruments match your expectations, and of course watch for traffic.
This is where you need a good scan. You don't need to be looking either entirely inside or entirely outside, just paying attention to what's going on. And then one of the things you do try this at home, is the way he puts it. Go and try simulate things. Use simulation software or simulation time of various sorts to see what you need to do. And for the purposes of this article, my colleague actually, as he put it, he fired up a PC simulator and deliberately made mistakes so that he could kind of write more accurately about some of these things. And it also can give you practice in a safe environment. So you can, you don't want to practice making mistakes, but you want to practice doing it right and catching yourself
and recovering from them.
Recovering.
Yeah. So our next one is all about the Loss of control in flight.
Yeah, we wanted to talk about for en route, that loss of control in flights persists as a cause of accidents. And it's, there's the definition there. It's a significant deviation from the flight path, the intended flight path that causes upset. And these are accidents that can and do occur in all phases of flight. Now, over here in the box, the yellow box, I couldn't resist quoting the Goose and Maverick, because at the time we were writing this, Top Gun Maverick was the movie out there, still is. And of course, this was from the original. No, Mav, this is not a good idea. And Goose, sorry, Goose, time to buzz the tower. If you have ever been tempted to be Maverick, this is where you need to channel your inner Goose and think, no, not a good idea. You cannot barrel ahead. So stupid pilot tricks are one of the ways that pilots can get themselves into loss of control situations. Hopefully nobody who is listening to this broadcast is that sort of pilot, but it always pays to say, hey, be careful. It can happen to you.
Yeah, and there's other ways, of course. Uncoordinated flight, equipment malfunctions, distractions, of course, weather, and, complacency and sort of intentional noncompliance and taking shortcuts. All these things, can lead to a possible loss of control. And of course, the IMC scenarios. You talked a little bit about, the ACS, slow flight and stalls. This is a really good review in the article.
And this is from several years ago. One of the ways that the FAA started looking at other ways to address loss of control in flight and to make sure that pilots really understand how to maneuver the aircraft at different airspeeds and in different phases of flight. And that was when it was in 2016 when we changed sort of the definition of the task for slow flight. But I've always liked this. I got it from one of my colleagues in the aviation community, actually, a practical, real-world way to think about what we started moving the evaluation standard to be. Slow flight is flight at airspeeds and configurations that you use. You actually use in normal flight operations, takeoff, departure, or approach and landing. So this is the reason that we don't want to perform that particular maneuver with the stall horn blaring. Now, when you have the stall horn, which is it's a notification of an impending stall, you should treat that as an abnormal situation and promptly perform the recovery. And then a pilot should always treat an unbriefed, unintentional full stall as an emergency and be prepared to execute a prompt and correct recovery. So that was the rationale behind it, and I think there's a lot of support for that nowadays.
Yeah, there's more information in the article, and we're on to approach and landing. And the emphasis of this is all about maintaining stabilized approaches. They quote some data that says you're almost 2.5 times more likely to be unstabilized if you start, with a steep angle of descent. The book gives information on, the 3-to-1 rule, which is quite familiar to everybody, but also how to calculate the required rate of descent. Basically, it's 5 times your ground speed. And for your instrument pilots who might be looking at your charts, that rate of descent is often displayed. If you're going 100 knots, 5 times your ground speed, you need about 500 feet per minute to maintain 3 degrees. You just need to sort out headwinds, tailwinds, things like that to sort it out. And then the other part of this is approaching airports with parallel runways. Be careful because sometimes the runways are positioned in different space. They're not next to one another necessarily, even though they're parallel. One could be displaced farther on down at the airport. I think the author used Pichu DeKalb Airport as an example. I've flown in it before, and it takes a little bit of time to sort that out. Plus, the other part about awareness is have wind awareness. The old tailwind on base thing is not just a problem for overshooting your desired runway, but having an incursion into the path of the other runway.
Not to mention a cross control stall.
Not to mention, so
The base to final cross control. This is another one of the if you know that you're going to be flying into an airport that either you haven't been to for a while, you've never been to, unfamiliar for whatever reason, check out from the flight deck, see if there is a video of it. But whether or not there is, another thing you can do, take out your iPad, bring up Google Earth, and just take a little cruise around. It is absolutely amazing what you can find out nowadays. So you can look for landmarks, you can look for what it looks like. There are a lot of electronic flight bag apps that will allow you to practice the entire flight, but especially get familiar with the approach and landing environment. And then, of course, he plays with the words here. That's the brakes. After landing, braking and safely braking and safely exiting the runway, use aerodynamic braking rather than burning up the mechanical brakes, and directional control. Always maintain directional control. It would be, it's not a great way to end the flight if you've had a perfect flight and then you do a runway excursion when you're landing. So
yeah, and that brings us up to the next one, which is down but not done.
Down but not done. So this is something that I've preached for a long time. If you've had the perfect flight in every way, but you just jump out of the airplane and you call it done, you've just ruined your perfect flight, because I kind of split it into two pieces: inspect the airplane and inspect your performance. Sure. So inspecting the airplane, and we talk about this as part of good aviation citizenship, leave the airplane at least as nice, if not better, than the way you found it, whether it's your own airplane or a rental. Make sure that you do a post-flight inspection and document any problems. Have it refueled, or you do whatever you need to do. The pre-flight checklist can be a guide to the post-flight. You could use that to develop a specific post-flight checklist, just to make sure that for the next person that's going to fly it, whether it's you or somebody else, that it's good to go. And then the inspecting your performance. This is something I think we all we're going to have to train ourselves to do. And I actually talked about the fact in here that we use pre-flight as a verb. Pre-flight can be a noun, it can be a verb, it can be pretty much an adjective, but we do not really use post-flight in the same way, either for the airplane or for ourselves. So I think a personal performance review is always a good idea. Take a few minutes to just sit in the airplane and think about what you did and make notes while it's still fresh, and think about what you could have done better. If you've got passengers, and again, this is with a proviso that there's a clear path for them, send them on to the FBO, and that gives you some space and quiet to do a little post-flight. Yeah, here's what I coulda, woulda, shoulda done better.
Yeah, and it's a way, again, to learn from any mistakes you might have made and to work on improvement for the next flight.
And if you got another pilot with you, that would be an opportunity for the two of you to have that conversation. But
a drone debrief. We've often had these discussions about the prevalence of drones and all of the items required for a successful drone flight is very much the same as
actually,
it is
though,
if not even more so.
When I read articles like this one, I realize more and more that actually being a remote pilot is in some ways a lot more complicated, because you not only have to do the standard things you would do, but you actually need to deal with your observers and other members of the crew. There's an awful lot that has to be done. So as the article points out, the FAA considers drone pilots to be pilots. That's what it's called, a remote pilot certificate. And every pilot, regardless of what you're flying, is responsible for being prepared for absolutely everything. So these are questions, and this article goes through all the questions that remote pilots should ask and answer.
And it's about following checklists and procedures.
Well, and in the post-flight, the batteries in the drone are in good condition, identify any issues, power off and store the equipment. So same idea, inspect the aircraft, inspect your performance.
And vertically speaking is our traditional column on rotorcraft. And the VAST, Vertical Aviation Safety Team, it's industry, government initiative, international, to bring safety concerns and remedies into this part of the industry, especially as we have more prevalence of the eVTOLs and urban air mobility aircraft. And of course, the United States Helicopter Safety Team, as the article points out, is best known for the safety enhancements. So it's always good information, and so many of the things that we discuss for different types of aircraft are relevant, and there's something to learn from each.
Well, there are. I particularly want to mention that fourth bullet: to identify, collect, harmonize, and deliver centralized access to safety information. And then the last bullet is the website, the VAST website, vast.aero. And it's got lots of reports and videos and event listings, all toward vertical aircraft safety. They also have, as you see in the green box over there, a recent global conference which had presentations on various issues, and mechanics received updates and training as well. So that was why they called it a vast difference for safety. And I think VAST is a pretty cool name, as well as I like their logo too. That's kind of fun.
It's good. FAA has got some interesting designations. I've learned to know that you have 3-letter acronyms for everything. They don't always make sense. But,
sure they do.
But AVP, what's...
Okay, so we thought that given that we were talking that this issue of the magazine was about avoiding danger zones that might lead you into accidents, we wanted to talk about introduce the FAA's Office of Accident Investigation and Prevention. And the prevention part is extremely important to them as well as to all of us. So here's what their mission is. And we wanted to provide some information about their 4 divisions. The Accident Investigation Division, that's the one people probably know the best because they work with the NTSB on accidents. But they have Safety Analytical Services that manages databases and works with the GA Joint Safety Committee. Safety Management and Research Planning. Research planning is all sorts of things, but this is the piece that collaborates with ICAO. And then, of course, like every organization, there's management services and recommendations, but recommendations means managing whenever there are NTSB or FAA safety recommendations that the FAA needs to act on in some way. So it's when I first came to the agency, it was a much smaller office, and it has grown considerably. And actually, it had a different name back then, but they gave it the Accident Investigation and Prevention name, with the idea that we're trying not to waste mistakes.
Of course. And it's led by FAA Faces is a regular feature in the magazine, and it's Kimberly Pyle.
Yeah, she's as you see here, she comes from a family of pilots. I didn't, but she is not a pilot herself, but she has an alternate flight path that kind of came through engineering systems, and that's what she ended up doing. She was in private sector policy work, lived overseas, then started working in the FAA's air traffic systems development. So she actually came to my part of the FAA from the air traffic organization, and is for the past year or so has been executive director for accident investigation and prevention. And these are all the things that she does. But in connection with this role, she also chairs the FAA's Safety Culture Executive Steering Committee. A lot of good stuff.
And her quote there at the bottom, her focus is to leverage data and quantitative research to do predictive analysis to better understand risks. So again, AVP is an essential part of this whole process.
And those ABCs, I like those in there.
Oh, apathy, boredom, and complacency.
Yeah, that is to prevent any of those things. And that's a pretty good summary of all the things that can cause problems.
Yeah, our nuts, bolts, and electron is about, of course, aviation maintenance training and the
new Part 147 rule.
And the best part about this is the idea that the aviation maintenance training schools can design their curriculum as long as it's regulatorily compliant, but can design your own technology and actually kind of change the focus to meet the needs of the students based on a particular operation and eliminate sort of the rigidness of it and be able to design better training curriculum.
Yeah, and this rule has been a long time coming. It took effect September 21st. So this article is a little bit longer than nuts, bolts, and electrons typically because we wanted to make sure we gave a pretty thorough treatment to this. But instead of using a curriculum that's locked into the into that specific rule, the FAA has worked for several years with the aviation community and the maintenance community to create airman certification standards for mechanics, and that will be used in connection with Part 147 schools. So this is it's a pretty substantial undertaking, and again, it's been a long time coming. The rule took effect in September. The ACS testing standard won't be used until July to give everybody time to make the transition to
I was impressed with the number of schools. There's 187 of them, a lot of students, and there's a lot of need for more AMTs in the workforce for sure. And medical factors, your colleague Susan Northrup always writes this, and this is essentially about the information about drugs and alcohol, and whenever they do an accident, they look for this. And some of the things that we've talked about before, diphenhydramine is a sedative, and it's common in
Benadryl.
A wide number
of a lot of things.
Yeah. So she basically makes the point there's simply no good reason to fly after taking sedating medication, alcohol.
Well, and that most there's a lot of cases where we've talked before, and this column has talked before about the perils of over-the-counter medication. It seems like it couldn't possibly hurt anything, but actually it could. There are things that I think one of the rules, the way I've heard it before, is that if you're sick enough to have to take medicine, maybe you are too sick to go flying. So not a bad rule of thumb.
And then this is a very good article to shed a little bit of light on coronary heart disease. What happens if you have an event, and are there some paths to yes? And yes, there are some paths. Of course, you need to work with your AME. It is possible that you can do it under basic med, but you'll need to get a special issuance. Yeah,
it's a one-time special issuance.
And then this also covers a little bit about how to get a special issuance. So I think there's been a change and an evolution in the FAA medical division to, again, how can we find pathways to yes?
Well, that's the whole idea. That
based on different indications.
If there is a safe pathway to yes, that's where they want to go. So this article was framed in terms of questions and answers. And of course, the top was, if I've got this, can I fly again? And I like that answer. Very likely, yes.
Yeah. So, and of course, in the other part in the article, it talks a little bit about risk management in this article as well, in that how we manage our own, diet, exercise, sleep, and things like this can help prevent this. But
we need to maintain ourselves as well as we maintain our airplanes.
That's right. But if we do, have an event, there is some options for us. As we kind of wind things up here, the ATIS is sort of just the news things. That a couple of things I noticed was the FAA interactive fact book.
There's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of facts that the FAA has put together about number of airports and different facts and figures. We mentioned earlier about the new course for IFR self-briefings. There's also one that we talked about for VFR self-briefings as well, and it all kind of goes along with Advisory Circular 9192 about doing pre-flight briefings.
And there are a couple of new videos, the rotorcraft video, and you had already mentioned the IFR self-briefing course. So a lot of content in this particular issue of ATIS. And
I always kind of look at the back of the book to see about the feedback, and I see people have made comments about the previous issues.
Yeah, we get comments. I'm not sure we actually get physical mail anymore. Not too many people do that, but we are reachable at safetybriefing@faa.gov and also through Twitter at FAA Safety Brief, and through the GA Facebook page that we have. Sometimes we have comments and questions and answers that come through that forum, and those get printed in form. Anytime anybody who writes to us, we always try to answer in one form or another. So always like to hear from people.
Yeah, and it's a good way just to get back information to you, because I mean, this magazine and this effort has always been, to try to stay in touch with the user group.
Absolutely.
And it's not just, the FAA sending out things.
We also appreciate getting ideas for what are topics people would like to see. So
all kinds of options for finding this. I still personally like the print copy. So,
there's the download in PDF, which is actually my favorite way to get it. So there's a lot of this is listed, but the FAA reorganized its website a while back, and we kind of like the way that they've framed our content. So we have the magazine here. The current issue is always featured, like you see here, but now we have direct links to each of the articles, and they are in the FAA's what it's called Medium blog. And then below that, if you look over there on the left-hand column where it's gray, there's the current issue, there's the archive, and then the fly-safe fact sheets that you can get access to all from that page. So sometimes when I'm trying to remember what we did, I go and look through the archives to see when and where we wrote about something. So good stuff.
Well, during the, the introductory, slideshow part where they present all the various magazine covers, we've covered a lot of ground, and I use it as reference material as well to go back and check up on something from time to time.
Indeed.
Social media presence.
Yeah, so we've got the Twitter at FAA Safety Brief, Facebook GA Safety Group. When it says the first rule is a compliance program, this is about sharing information and not wasting mistakes. Give back to the community. There's the YouTube playlist. We participate in the FAA's Instagram stories, and as I mentioned, in the FAA's Medium blog.
And
just a reminder of how to get wings credit, the two-step process, links to the podcast, archive courses, print copy, and much, much more. Easy way to get to anything that you need to get to.
Take the test, get wings credit, and this is a good way to keep our heads in the game and stay proficient. This is typically the time when we talk about the next issue. But now,
well, there will be a next issue, which will be the last one that I am the editor for. But this is the last FAA Safety Briefing Live because in January I will be retiring. Next chapter to be written. And but I want to say thank you to you, Paul, for being part of Safety Briefing Live for all this time, and certainly to the man behind the curtain, John Typen, who has made all of this work. In I think it's 28 editions that we've done now over the past couple of years.
Well, I think it's 28, maybe 29, and I know that we've had data that shows there's been about 75,000 views. It's
a lot. So thank you for being
appreciate that,
for being part of the audience. And as we say on the next and last slide here, thank you for watching and for being part of FAA Safety Briefing Live over the past, year and a half, 2 years?
Oh, I think it's more than that.
It's more than that. It feels like a long time.
Time flies when you're having fun, right?
Time flies when you're having fun. So Thanks to John Typin. Thanks to you. Thanks to the audience, to everybody for being part of a really good thing. I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm going to miss about, working for the FAA, and I will certainly miss the magazine, but it's going to be in good hands, and I'll say an official farewell in the next issue.
Very good.
All right,
Everybody,
thanks.
everybody take care. Stay safe.